Now, down to business. And I've just got one question to ask. Well, no, actually two. One, what the hell is going on at Disney? And two, what are parents and politicians going to do about it? Now, this week, you may have seen some headlines about strange going on at the Disney theme parks. Once fun for the whole family entertainment venues that have lately been captured by genderqueer activists who may as well have been plucked from a university campus or a Reddit thread on alternative sexualities, and who are determined to literally capture the castle of family values, to not only inject sex talk into children's entertainment venues, but also to undermine what parents teach their children about biology, sex, and sexuality. Don't believe me? Have a look.
I don't have to be afraid to let's have these two characters kiss. Let's in the background. I was just wherever I could, just basically adding queerness to if you see anything queer in the show, I'm proud family. But I just was no one would stop me, and no one was trying to stop me.
One of our execs stood up and said, we only have a handful of queer leads in our content. And I went, what? That can't be true. And I realized, it actually is true. We have many, many, many LGBTQIA characters in our stories, and yet we don't have enough leads.
Last summer, we removed all of the gendered greetings in relationship to our live spiels. So we no longer say ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. We've provided training for all of our cast members in relationship to that. So now they know it's hello everyone or hello friends.
And this all has come in after Disney vowed to use its corporate muscle to go against the Florida legislature's relatively tame but much derided so-called Don't Say Gay bill, which is perfectly reasonable to everyone except those who believe that kindergarten kids should not have to be proselytized to by transgender activists. And we have also seen the Biden White House weigh in on this, not just on Florida's legislation, they're against it if you hadn't guessed, but also in favor of life-changing and often permanent treatment to children identifying as trans. Now, of course, no one wants to do anything to discriminate or hurt people of any age who don't fit into the heterosexual norm. But this attempt to foist highly politicized sexual gender theories and lifestyles on young people really does feel like the next step in the critical theory agenda. And it is quite a step forward from the situations which we have seen recently, where schools and teachers talk about these things behind closed doors and then creepily tell students not to tell their parents about it. No, this feels like a direct shot against the bow of the very families that made Disney great for decades, and an attempt to alienate, in the style of all left-wing revolutionary movements, parents from children. Now, fortunately, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, again, my tip for the Republican nominee in 2024, is fighting back. Governor DeSantis has now started, yes, to toy with the possibility of revoking Disney's special status, which gives it the right in law to run Disney as essentially a self-governing entity that allows it to do pretty much anything it wants when it comes to how it behaves. Known as the 1967 Reedy Creek Improvement Act, it allows Disney to be its own government, essentially on the sovereign territory of Florida. But perhaps not for long. Here's what DeSantis had to say the other day.
There are certain entities that have exerted a lot of influence through corporate means to generate special privileges in the law. I don't think we should have special privileges in the law at all.
And Florida House member Spencer Roach, meanwhile, reported on Twitter that, quote, yesterday was the second meeting in a week with fellow legislators to discuss a repeal of the 1967 Reedy Creek Improvement Act, which allows Disney to act as its own government. He went on to say that if Disney wants to embrace woke ideology, it seems fitting that they should be regulated by Orange County. Well, that could be it for the Disney self-governing entity, because you know what they say, build a better mousetrap. Perhaps now it's woke Mickey's turn. Xi Jinping, who's sort of the Dan Andrews of China, but you know,
well, he's learned. Well,
I think he's watched those clips we show of the Victorian police going and dealing with demonstrators, and says, "Yeah, well, that's actually not a bad idea. Maybe we should do that." So they put the entire city in lockdown. I think they've tried to test everybody on one side of the river, and now they're going to do the other side. But they have this whole elimination fantasy. The real scary thing is, though, is that, well, here, even in Australia, we've gotten on with this more or less.
Most of Australia.
But, you know, in places like Shenzhen and places that make all sorts of components and products for the world, they're going back into these lockdowns. So I predict there's going to be a lot more economic supply chain chaos coming out of Xi Jinping's zero-tolerance COVID policy. It is just insane that the left and that the Biden administration is the continuation of the Obama presidency when it comes to basically empowering Iran to get nuclear weapons and rewrite the entire balance of power in the Middle East. It's shocking. And at the same time, Biden and his people are talking tough about Russia and Ukraine and all of this sort of thing, that they're letting this happen. Now, Iran and Russia are pals. What is going on? It is utterly leaderless. And it is, you know, on every single front, you're going to wind up with a weaker America. What Biden was talking about, a lot of what he was talking about, especially around regime change. I mean, like the idea that saying, oh, well, what we want to do is we want to, you know, have a real successful regime change operation like we did in, Iraq. Boy, how well did that go?
Libya went really well.
Libya went really well, so that we would want to do that again with a nuclear-armed superpower. I'm not really sure that's a great idea. So walking that back was absolutely the right thing to do. Everything else, it's a muddle, it's confusion, it is a joke. The thing about a guy like Putin is, you know, believe him when he says what he's going to do. The great foreign policy failure of the West for the last 2, 3, 4 decades really has been to refuse to listen to our rivals, our adversaries, and yes, our enemies when they say what they're going to do. Putin has been talking about Ukraine forever, just in the same way, you know, Al-Qaeda was ramping up, you know, in the years to 9/11. We knew what they were going to do, and yet everybody refused in the so-called brilliant establishment, aka the swamp, as Trump called it, you know, knew that this was going to happen. Well, I'll tell you what, Peter, we've been talking about this on this show for at least a year now, about the really obvious cognitive decline here. The point I'd make is that you look at these, you know, note cards and cheat sheets, they're not, you know, aid memoirs for complicated facts or a bunch of figures to have in front of you while you're having a high-level conversation. I can perfectly understand that we all do that from time to time. That's fine. These were pre-typed out answers to different questions, so he would know what to say about very basic things about what's happening in Ukraine, with Russia, with the American position towards Russia. And I'm concerned that this is just very dangerous because we don't even know who's writing these cards, much less what thought is being put into the policy behind them. So are these groups, Olga, then being funded by governments? And if they're getting money from governments, is this a way then essentially for the left to escape scrutiny and the sort of legislative scrutiny about where people's and taxpayers' money goes in terms of funding a leftist agenda that most people wouldn't agree with in the Middle East or really anywhere else?
Well, I'm not even sure that most of the people will know what these groups are promoting. So what happens is that taxpayers' money are being used to promote values that are they're directly opposed to those that governments officially have vis-a-vis Israel or the conflict. Let's take you mentioned Amnesty International. Let's take their latest report, which tries to make a legal claim that Israel is an apartheid state. No government, most of the governments oppose that very clearly. Yet you have one of the largest human rights groups that comes with a tremendous halo around it. Everyone trusted for doing the right thing around the world and for flagging violations of human rights, saying exactly the opposite. Now, why? Because they're trying to make a legal case that will be used to push the International Criminal Court in The Hague to continue with the investigation against Israel. It is unheard of, and all this wrapped up in a context of human rights.
But you won't increase taxes.
Yeah, we've made it very clear. We have all of our policies out there for all to see.
Will you be increasing taxes?
We will be announcing our measure on multinational tax evasion.
And And then the other day, there's a reply speech. He said, no family is going to be worse off. Well, I'll tell you what, they are going to be worse off because I can tell you right now, the stage 3 tax cuts, if Labor wins, they're not going to happen. I can imagine that there will be some sort of aged care levy. That was very much the subtext of what was being talked about in that speech. But the third thing is, too, inflation is going to start driving up wages and costs, so we are all going to suffer bracket creep, which is going to be another form of tax rise that is not going to be addressed. And frankly, that's not being addressed by either government at the moment, but that's another story. I do think we have to give a little bit of a whack to the government here because, frankly, their budget, it's not doing much in the way of cutting spending or taxes or anything else like that. And the budget assumptions show payments as a percentage of the budget staying at post-pandemic levels forever. So we're never getting a government under either side that's going to be down to the already huge size it was before the pandemic. I would love to see either side try and do some sort of, reform, but I think economic reform died. I don't know whether it was of COVID or with COVID.
Climate change is here and its consequences are devastating. Just look at what we've announced on climate change. Powering Australia. Labor will end the climate wars, tackle the challenge of climate change. We will act on climate change and seize the chance to transform our country. Dealing with climate change presents opportunities.
It's really, really interesting because you called it his budget reply speech, but the funny thing about a budget is that you expect there to be some numbers and costs and figures in there. And this was a speech that was very much not about this. But it's funny, though, that he talked about climate because he also talked about old people and aged care, which we do agree in this country needs a lot of work. But there's a very funny, cynical bit of politics happening here. In 2019, Bill Shorten said, climate change, that's testing well. Let's run out with that in the election. But people said, I'm not so sure about paying for it. And he fell over. Now, Albo has said, well, aged care, that's testing well. We've had 2 years of don't kill grandma through the pandemic and all of that. Maybe they'll pony up for this. So I think it's very cynical what's going on here.
Wow.